At 78 years old, Benny Andersson no longer sounds like a man interested in protecting the fantasy. He does not need to. He has lived long enough to see the myth of ABBA rise, harden, glitter, and settle into history like something almost untouchable. To the world, ABBA became more than a group. They became a symbol of perfect pop, of unforgettable melodies, dazzling harmonies, and a kind of emotional brightness that seemed to float above ordinary life. But beneath that shine, beneath the costumes, the choruses, and the global adoration, there was always something else in the music, something listeners could feel even if they could not name it. There was joy, yes, but there was also ache. There was polish, but there was also tension. There was beauty, but beneath that beauty there was restraint, silence, and something unresolved. And now, in the way Benny reflects on the past, in the calm honesty of a man who no longer has anything to prove, he seems to confirm what many suspected all along. ABBA was never built on perfection. It was built on emotion held together by discipline, on private fragility transformed into public elegance, and on music that often said what real life could not. That may be the deepest truth of Benny Andersson's story. Before ABBA became one of the most beloved acts in music history, Benny was not chasing celebrity. He was chasing feeling. Long before the world knew his name, he was already drawn to the emotional logic of melody, to the way music could hold sadness and beauty in the same moment. He grew up in a world shaped by traditional sounds, by structure, by musical memory, and by the quiet seriousness that often defines artists before fame ever touches them. That foundation matters, because it explains why Benny's relationship to music always seemed more intimate than performative. He was not merely writing songs to be consumed. He was building emotional spaces. Even later, when ABBA became synonymous with instant pop pleasure, Benny's fingerprints remained in the deeper currents of the sound. He understood that the strongest melodies are not simply catchy. They contain contradiction. They lift, but they also linger. They move the body while quietly unsettling the heart. That is one reason ABBA's songs have lasted so long. They do not just entertain people for 3 minutes. They stay with them for decades. And that is where the suspicion begins to make sense. Fans did not just fall in love with ABBA because the songs were fun. They fell in love because the songs felt alive in a way few pop songs do. There was always a strange, emotional richness beneath the surface. Even the brightest records carried a shadow. Even the biggest sing-along choruses seemed to contain a private sadness hiding just underneath the rhythm. For years, people sensed that this was not accidental. They sensed that the music was doing more than sounding good. It was carrying something. Benny's later life perspective gives that feeling new meaning. He does not need to announce some grand scandal for the truth to become visible. In fact, the real confirmation is quieter than gossip and more powerful. It is the realization that ABBA's greatness did not come from 4 people living inside a fairy tale. It came from 4 people creating beauty while living through the complicated, imperfect, deeply human reality of being themselves. Benny's genius was never loud. That is part of why he was so often misunderstood. In a group with visually striking performers and instantly recognizable voices, he could easily be seen as the man at the piano, the craftsman behind the scenes, the technical mind helping keep the machine running. But that image was always incomplete. Benny was not simply arranging notes in the background. He was shaping emotional architecture. He understood how a chord progression could shift the emotional temperature of an entire song. He understood how a melody could smile while still carrying longing. He understood how restraint could be as powerful as release. These are not the instincts of a cold technician. They are the instincts of someone who feels deeply but expresses it carefully. And perhaps that is one of the most revealing things about him. Benny often seemed most open through music, not through spectacle, not through confession, and not through the kind of public vulnerability that audiences are trained to look for. The piano, the arrangement, the harmonic turn, the delicate balance between brightness and ache. That is where he placed a part of himself that words may not have held as easily. The more you look at ABBA through that lens, the more their music changes. Suddenly, what once sounded effortless begins to sound costly. The perfection is still there, but now it feels earned in a different way. It no longer sounds like the product of a dream world. It sounds like the product of emotional precision. There is a difference. Dream worlds float above reality. Emotional precision comes from living inside reality and shaping it until it becomes bearable. That may be what Benny confirms in the broadest sense. Music was never just decoration for ABBA. It was structure. It was language. It was a place where difficult feelings could be transformed into something shareable, graceful, and enduring. That is why the songs are so easy to love and so hard to exhaust. They were made not only with talent, but with need. And yet that gift carries a paradox. When a person becomes highly skilled at expressing feeling through art, he can begin to depend on art to do the feeling for him. He can become more articulate in melody than in conversation, more truthful in a composition than in a confrontation, safer inside structure than in ordinary emotional exposure. Benny's story seems haunted by that possibility, not because he was dishonest, but because music may have been the form in which he was most protected and most revealed at once. There is something both beautiful and tragic about that. To build music that reaches millions while using it, perhaps, as a shelter from the messier demands of ordinary life, is not hypocrisy. It is a very human adaptation. But it also has consequences. When music becomes refuge, it can also become distance. When songs become the place where truth is processed, real relationships can be left trying to survive on what has not been spoken plainly enough outside the studio. That tension may explain why ABBA's music often feels so emotionally exact. The songs do not sound like fantasy because they were not made by people floating above reality. They were made by people who understood reality intimately and, at times, may have needed music to survive it. Listeners sensed this even when they could not explain it. They sensed that the music was holding opposing forces together: ecstasy and sadness, confidence and vulnerability, polish and fracture. Benny's role in that balance was enormous. He knew how to keep a song from collapsing under the weight of its own feeling. He knew how to refine pain without sterilizing it. He knew how to let a melody carry a bruise without making the whole structure bleed. That is why ABBA's records feel so sophisticated beneath their apparent simplicity. The brilliance is not in complexity for its own sake. The brilliance is in emotional control. Still, emotional control can become its own burden. In any legendary group, there are visible roles and invisible ones. There are those who naturally draw the light, and those who help shape the conditions under which that light can exist. Benny often appeared to belong to the second category. He was steady, disciplined, focused, and less interested in performing personality than in getting the work right. From the outside, that can look like calm. But calm is not always ease. Sometimes it is containment. Sometimes it is the expression of someone who has learned to carry pressure quietly. The danger, of course, is that quiet people are often assumed to be unaffected. But the one who speaks least is not always the one who feels least. He may simply be the one who has learned to turn feeling into function. And when that happens over many years, inside a group, inside an image, inside the exhausting machinery of worldwide success, the private cost can become very high. That cost is easier to see when we stop romanticizing fame. Fame does not distribute meaning equally. It distributes attention unevenly. In a group like ABBA, the audience saw glamour, charisma, beauty, image, and emotional projection through performance. But behind all of that was the work itself, the architecture of feeling, the melodic intelligence, the compositional decisions that made the songs more than momentary hits. Benny helped build that architecture. Yet the people who shape foundations are not always the people the world most easily remembers as central. That creates a strange kind of invisibility. Not literal invisibility, of course, but emotional invisibility within success. A person can be essential and still feel misunderstood. He can be celebrated and still feel only partially seen. He can be at the center of greatness, while watching others become the more legible symbols of it. For someone like Benny, That kind of misreading may have hurt not because he craved cheap applause, but because his work carried so much of who he actually was. And this is where the emotional mystery of ABBA becomes even more compelling. The group's most powerful songs do not feel detached from life. They feel shaped by lives under pressure. The longer the band existed, the more clearly that pressure seemed to enter the work. This does not reduce the music. It elevates it. Because when people under strain manage to create something graceful, that grace means more. It is not innocence. It is craft under emotional weather. Benny appears, in retrospect, as one of the great emotional editors of that weather. He knew how to take intensity and give a contour. He knew how to prevent a song from becoming melodrama while still allowing it to carry ache. He knew how to make feeling danceable without making it shallow. That is an extraordinary skill, and it may be one of the hidden reasons the music still sounds so fresh. It was never trivial. It was simply elegant enough to disguise the weight it was carrying. Of course, elegance can also hide wounds. That may be the part that age has made easier for Benny to acknowledge. Not necessarily through direct confessions, and certainly not through the sort of cheap sensationalism that so often follows famous people, but through perspective. With distance, patterns become harder to deny. You begin to see what role the work really played in your life. You begin to understand what it protected you from, what it allowed you to say, and what it may have kept you from saying. That is why Benny's later reflections feel so significant. He is not merely remembering ABBA as a career achievement. He seems to be seeing it as a human system, one in which music did far more than entertain the public. It absorbed pressure. It mediated emotion. It transformed personal complexity into communal beauty. That does not make the songs less authentic. It makes them more so. There is also something important in how quietly ABBA ended. People often expect legendary stories to conclude with explosions. They want betrayal, dramatic final arguments, public breakdowns, and simple villains. But life rarely respects those narrative cravings. Many endings do not arrive as disasters. They arrive as thinning energy, as accumulated silence, as the slow realization that something can still function outwardly while no longer feeling fully alive inwardly. ABBA's ending has always carried that haunting quality. It was not only the breakup of a group, it was the fading of a specific emotional chemistry. The structure that once turned private complexity into shared transcendence could not sustain itself forever. Not because the talent vanished, but because the inner conditions changed. Discipline became exhaustion. Professionalism became distance. The very qualities that once held everything together may have made it harder to stop early enough to say what was truly happening. That kind of ending is sadder than scandal, because it offers no clean release. There is no satisfying moment where one event explains everything. Instead, there is only the recognition that the music had been carrying more than the people inside it could continue carrying forever. And Benny's long view of the story seems to confirm exactly that. The collapse was not necessarily dramatic on the outside, because the deeper drama had been internal for a long time. It lived in the pressure of continuing. It lived in the emotional intelligence required to keep making beauty under strain. It lived in the gap between what the world consumed and what the people creating it were actually navigating. Once you understand that, the silence surrounding the end of ABBA does not feel empty. It feels full of everything that had gone unsaid. What makes Benny so compelling now is that he does not appear interested in rewriting the band into tragedy. He does not need to. He understands, perhaps better than ever, that the greatness of ABBA and the vulnerability of the people inside it are not opposing truths. They belong together. In fact, one may explain the other. Great art is often born not from emotional ease, but from emotional necessity. It comes from people trying to find shape, rhythm, and coherence in the middle of uncertainty. Benny's musicianship always seemed rooted in that instinct. He did not merely chase nice sounds. He chased emotional rightness. Even when the songs sparkled, they carried the discipline of someone searching for a deeper resolution than pop surfaces usually allow. That is why his work does not age like disposable entertainment. It ages like craft built from real need. And perhaps that is the confirmation people were reaching for all along. They suspected that ABBA's emotional power could not have come from image management alone. They suspected that something more private and more fragile was involved. They suspected that the songs were not just expertly made, but inwardly inhabited. Benny's life and work now seem to support that reading. He does not have to spell everything out in sensational terms for the truth to come through. It is there in the pattern. It is there in the way the music feels. It is there in the contrast between the brightness of the public image and the depth of the songs themselves. It is there in the unmistakable sense that the melodies were often carrying feelings more complicated than the era's pop packaging suggested. Time has a way of stripping away performance. For artists especially, age can do something younger success rarely allows. It can separate identity from noise. At 78, Benny Andersson does not need the world's permission to tell the truth gently. He only needs clarity. And clarity, in his case, is more devastating than scandal. Because the truth that emerges is not that ABBA was fake. It is that ABBA was human in ways the polished image could never fully contain. The magic was real. The songs were real. The joy was real. But so were the pressures, the silences, the personal contradictions, and the emotional costs of turning life into music on that scale. That is the kind of truth people sense long before they can articulate it. Benny's later life perspective simply gives that intuition a form. Seen that way, his legacy becomes even more powerful. He is not just one of pop's great songwriters. He is one of its great emotional constructors. Someone who understood that a song could hold two opposite truths at once and become stronger for it. He understood that sorrow need not erase beauty, and that beauty need not deny sorrow. He understood that music could be both shelter and exposure, both performance and confession, both polish and plea. That understanding is woven through ABBA's catalog. It is why the songs feel emotionally larger than their running times. It is why people of different generations keep returning to them and discovering something new. They may arrive for nostalgia, but they stay because the feelings still ring true. There is also something moving about what Benny's story suggests about survival. Not survival in the dramatic sense, but in the quieter sense, the ability to endure your own life by making meaning out of it. For some people, that happens through conversation, reflection, or direct vulnerability. For others, it happens through work. For Benny, music seems to have been one of the central ways he made life coherent enough to live inside. That does not diminish the art. It explains its urgency. The songs mattered because they were not ornamental. They were lived through. They were shaped by a mind that did not treat melody as decoration, but as a form of emotional truth. And when audiences heard that truth, even unconsciously, they recognized it. That is why the songs did not simply succeed. They endured. So when people say that Benny Andersson, at 78, has finally confirmed what we suspected all along, the most honest version of that statement is not tabloid-sized. It is larger, deeper, and more human than that. He confirms that ABBA's brilliance was never detached from struggle. He confirms that the music worked because it was made by people who understood longing, pressure, beauty, and fracture intimately enough to transform them into song. He confirms that elegance can come from emotional complexity, that joy can coexist with sadness, and that some of the greatest pop music ever written was not the product of perfection, but of people trying to hold themselves together through craft. And maybe that is why ABBA still matters so much. Not merely because the songs are unforgettable, but because they carry the shape of real life without collapsing into bitterness. They take pain and give it melody. They take uncertainty and give it structure. They take human contradiction and make it sing. Benny's role in that achievement is impossible to overstate. He helped build a sound that made millions feel lighter, even when it came from deeply serious artistic instincts. He helped prove that pop music can be sophisticated without becoming cold, emotional without becoming messy, and lasting without losing its immediate charm. That is rare. That is legacy. In the end, Benny Andersson does not need to tear down the legend of ABBA to tell the truth about it. He only needs to let us see it more clearly. And what we see, finally, is not a shattered illusion, but a richer one. We see that behind the glow stood human beings, not symbols. We see that behind the perfection stood process, restraint, and emotional intelligence. We see that behind the unforgettable melodies stood a man who may have said his deepest truths most fully through music. And once you understand that, once you really hear ABBA through that lens, the songs do not lose their magic. They gain more of it. Because now the beauty does not seem accidental. It seems earned. It seems lived. It seems like the sound of fragile people creating something stronger than themselves. That may be the real confession at the heart of Benny's story. Not that everything was darker than we knew, but that everything was more human than we imagined. The glamour was real, but it was never the whole story. The success was immense, but it came with a cost. The melodies were radiant, but they were often carrying shadows. And Benny, quiet as he always seemed, was one of the people who understood that best. At 78, he does not need to shout it. He only needs to stand near the truth long enough for the rest of us to hear what was in the music all along. And what was there all along was not just fame, not just talent, not just pop perfection. It was longing. It was control. It was silence shaped into beauty. It was emotion made survivable through melody. It was for people building something timeless, while living through all the ordinary fragility that fame could never erase. That is what Benny Andersson finally seems to confirm. And that is why the story of ABBA remains far more powerful than the myth. Because myths glitter, but human truth, when turned into music like this, lasts forever.